Nitzan, I'd like you to talk to somebody. Stay on the line. I mean, we absolutely hear what you're saying. And Laura, are you still there?
Yes, I am.
Listen to Oliver, respond to Oliver. Oliver Kamm joins us, columnist for The Times.
Good morning.
Good morning, Oliver. Oliver continues to support the war in Iraq. Tell Laura, tell Nitzan why it was the right thing to do.
It was the right thing to do because Saddam Hussein was not an imminent but an emerging threat to international security. We would have had to face down his threats to regional stability as well as the genocidal actions against what I refuse to call his own people but constituent parts of Iraq, and it was better that we did it at a time of our choosing rather than of his.
That is so pompous, it's untrue.
Well, thank you for your interesting expression of that point of view, but that happens to be the view of most of the governments of Western democracies. If you follow your argument through
to its logical conclusion, then as the previous caller said, then why haven't we got rid of Mugabe? Why haven't we gone into Korea? And there are other dictatorships around the world. There is, because as the other caller mentioned, there is no strategic or there's no...
I don't think you were listening to the answer that I just gave. The reason we faced down Saddam Hussein was because he was in breach of clear undertakings that led to the ceasefire of the first Gulf War. He was in breach of resolutions, UN Security Council resolutions 678 and 687, that saw the ceasefire in the first Gulf War. We didn't start the Gulf War of 2003, he was in breach of the war that he had launched in 1990 by invading and annexing Kuwait.
And
we were responding to his aggression.
Has Israel done of United Nations sanctions? How many breaches have they done?
United Nations sanctions? Do you mean United Nations resolutions?
You're just being pedantic.
Well, it's actually rather an important point with the difference between sanctions and resolutions. Israel is not in breach of any UN Security Council resolutions. It's firmly abiding by UN Security Council Resolution 242, which envisages a two-state territorial accommodation to end the conflict. That's completely different from the position of Saddam Hussein, who was in breach of serial UN Security Council resolutions, 17 or 18 at the time he was finally taken at his word and faced down.
Do you think, let's hear from Mark in Leamington Spa as well. Good morning, Mark. What would you say to Oliver?
Morning, Nicky. Morning, Oliver. Oliver, I appreciate that your research tells you the points that you have raised, but am I not right in saying that Iraq as a country was facing drone missiles, severe sanctions in the time leading up to the 2003 war? Is it not true that Iraq as a country was being destabilised by our own security forces, and from an infrastructure point of view, it was crippled?
You make a fair point. Let me distinguish, however, between Iraq as a sovereign nation and the psychopathic criminal gangster regime that was in charge of it. Saddam Hussein and his appalling family could ride out any amount of sanctions because they were unconcerned with the condition of Iraq's people. The containment and sanctions regime that was increasingly threadbare and which he was testing would not have lasted much longer. It certainly wouldn't have lasted the sort of division and dissent that we were seeing in the UN Security Council when certain constituent members of the permanent members of the UN Security Council were simply not interested in applying the resolutions of the body itself.
What about the way it was presented when Tony Blair said that the intelligence, the picture painted by the intelligence agencies was extensive, detailed and authoritative? The way that it clearly was not. The way that spin infected the intelligence reports. Was that responsible government?
It was the consensus of governments of Western democracies at the time. It was clearly founded on bad intelligence, but we have already had two parliamentary inquiries, plus the Hutton inquiry and the Butler inquiry, into these aspects of the war. What the opponents, or I was going to say the opponents of the Iraq war, but in fact the haters of Tony Blair are looking for, is finally to come up with some quasi-judicial means of arriving at what they see as the right answer. That's irresponsible government.
And what about those people? We see the texts, we hear the calls, we read the emails all the time who say that he is actually a war criminal. How do you dismiss that?
With derision.
By what means, sorry, Oliver?
With derision. If people can't distinguish between a Prime Minister pursuing a policy that they conscientiously disagree with and a war criminal, someone of the type of Saddam Hussein, then they are not serious participants in this conversation.
Richard and what? Oh, Laura, you coming back in, are you?
Well, just thinking, listening to Oliver there, it just sounds so pompous. It's going back to the Mugabe example. Why have we not walked into Zimbabwe and removed him? The principles are still the same. That was a despot leader, starving his people to death, ruining the country and fleecing off money for himself. So what is the difference between him and Saddam Hussein? The difference is that Zimbabwe have got nothing that we want.
No,
Saddam Hussein he had stocks of oil, which we wanted, and we in the West wanted to make sure that we got it. So we did. We marched in, removed him, we secured the oil supply. It's just so pompous to hear you talking.
Yeah, that's the third time you've used the word. And if you listen to yourself back, you wouldn't actually have many grounds on which to make that judgment. Of course, the Western democracies, the international community, were interested in oil. Should they not have been interested in oil? But that is not the reason. That's not the distinctive characteristic between Saddam Hussein and Robert Mugabe. And I can tell you're not a reader of my newspaper, The Times, because we have actually called for intervention in Zimbabwe. But the major difference...
Well, you obviously haven't made a very loud noise, Oliver, because nobody's taken any notice.
I can only express my opinions just as you can. I don't actually control the levers of power. But the major difference between Saddam Hussein and Robert Mugabe is that Saddam Hussein had given undertakings in 1991 to adhere to UN Security Council resolutions in return for the ceasefire, not the termination, the ceasefire of the war that he had provoked by invading and annexing Kuwait in 1990. There is no such case in Zimbabwe.
And why did Lord Butler, he of the Butler Inquiry, tell the House of Lords in 2007 that Tony Blair had been disingenuous?
Because he took a judgment on the way that intelligence had been presented. But you're asking me about an inquiry that has already been and concluded. We've had two such inquiries.
Well, we have to
inquires.
we have to infer from the reasons. Well, why was he disingenuous? I said, why was he disingenuous? Because he was absolutely desperate to wage this war. Why was he desperate to wage this war? Because people then infer, because he was desperate to ride on the coattails of George Bush for whatever reason. Why was he so desperate to do that? Why did Tony Blair, set in stone this decision long before Parliament had had the chance to decide? Why?
It's very obvious that you've stopped quoting Lord Butler at an early stage of that peroration.
I'm saying what people say. I'm trying to deliver the arguments on the other side from your position, Oliver, as to what people argue.
Yes, you can actually go back further than that and refer to Tony Blair's speech at the Council on Foreign Relations in Chicago in 1999, where he got right the nature of the international order much earlier than anyone else, and he pointed to two despots in particular, Slobodan Milosevic and Saddam Hussein, as threats to international security. He was right. I would have been amazed and appalled if a man with such a clear perception of the nature of the international order had not been thinking of military action in 2002. But the reason for military action in 2002, after 9/11, when it was clear that the Western democracies were vulnerable to terrorist attack. But the reason we did so in 2003 was to give every chance for Saddam Hussein to comply with what the UN Security Council required of him, and he declined to do so.
And Tony Blair has a clear conscience.
I've never met Tony Blair. I've never spoken to him. I admire him. I write about him. I don't know what his mental states are, but he certainly ought to have for having been a distinguished and thoroughgoing, perceptive international statesman.
Oh, dear. So that's why I was elected president of the EU, was it? That's why I wasn't even considered. Somebody of such great standing and stature wasn't even considered.
I'm very happy to talk about the position of President of the European Council.
We don't want to, really.
I think we'll stick on the subject at hand.
Thank you very much, sir, thus far. 9:48.